Welcome back to Understanding Human Anatomy and our discussion of the thoracic wall, Part 2. Now, in this video, I want to talk more about the intercostal space, but first, what I want to do is take a look at a cross-section through the thorax. So, I'm going to diagram a cross-section as if we cut through the thorax like this line indicates. Now let's start by sketching in a thoracic vertebra with the body and the lamina and pedicles. And we'll have a transverse process on each side and a spinous process projecting like so. Cleaning it up a little bit. Then, on each side, we're going to have a rib. And remember, the head of the rib articulates between two bodies, and then the tubercle of the rib articulates with the transverse process. So we'll draw head of the rib in on the other side. Like so. And since the ribs do not run in the horizontal plane, but rather they run obliquely downward as they wrap around anteriorly, we only see part of several ribs when we look at a section like I talked about. So we'll draw the pieces of those ribs in here. And then anteriorly, we're going to have the sternum. Now, what you have to remember is that there is a muscular wall that is forming the thoracic wall along with the ribs. And if we follow the musculature, it will look something like this. So you see that the body of the thoracic vertebra projects anteriorly into the thorax, and that the thoracic cavity, when you look at it in cross-section like we have here, is shaped somewhat like a heart, like a Valentine heart. And just lateral to the bodies of the vertebra, just lateral to the vertebral column, we have indentations. And those indentations are referred to as gutters. So that we have a gutter on each side of the vertebral bodies. That's important to remember because there are structures that sit back here that you would think would be up at this level, but are stuck back in the gutter, and therefore they're not quite in the position you would casually think. Okay? So keep that in mind, that the thoracic cavity is heart-shaped in cross-section. Now I want you to remind you of a slide I showed in a previous video about the innervation and vascular supply to the trunk. Now I want you to remember this slide because it shows that the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve wraps around the body wall. And in this case we're talking about the thorax. This is generalized, it could be thorax or abdomen. But in the thorax it would come around like so, in between layers of muscle. And the muscle that it's running between are the intercostal muscles. You also see that in this picture we showed a branch of the aorta on each side running along with the nerve. Okay, the nerve, the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve would be our intercostal nerve, and this would be our intercostal artery. What I don't have in this diagram is an intercostal vein, but it would be running along with it. So we have a nerve, an artery, and a vein. Let's take a look at a section through an intercostal space. We'll start by just drawing in two ribs. Here's one rib, and we're taking a cross section through the rib. And the other rib is down here. And you notice that I did not draw the rib as an oval, that there's this indentation on the inferior side. That indentation is called the costal groove. The costal groove, and the intercostal artery, vein, and nerve will run in this groove so that they're protected by some bone. I should mention this is the external side, this is the internal side of the thoracic cavity. Let's start drawing in the muscles, and I'm going to use the same colors as we used in the previous video for the muscles. So the innermost intercostal I'm drawing here, and I'll draw just a little bit of it for the next rib down. And Then let me draw in the internal intercostal right here. And again, down here, I'll draw a little piece of it. And finally, the external intercostal here, and then here. So, let me put some labels in. Innermost intercostal, there. I'll draw a line. The internal intercostal, which is in green, and the external intercostal muscle, and the external intercostal muscle I've drawn in brown. Now, that leaves a space, and I have greatly exaggerated the space, but I want it easy for you to see the space. That gives us a space here between the internal intercostal and the innermost intercostal. And this space is referred to as the neurovascular space. And the neurovascular space is the area in which we find the intercostal nerves, arteries, and veins. So let me draw in some of these structures. Let's start with the intercostal vein. And we're going to find the intercostal vein most superior in the neurovascular space of each intercostal space. So there is the intercostal vein. And we'll draw an arrow to it. I shouldn't say arrow. We'll draw a line to it. The intercostal vein. The next structure is the intercostal artery. And we'll draw that in red. And I've drawn the intercostal artery with a much thicker wall than the intercostal vein, because arteries have thick walls, veins have thin walls. So let me label this. So we have the intercostal artery, and we'll connect a line over to it. And finally, we have an intercostal nerve. You notice I'm drawing that in as solid structure because nerves are solid. They don't have a lumen. They're not carrying blood. The intercostal nerve and remember, the intercostal nerve is just the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve. And we'll draw a line over to it. Now, on the inferior side of the intercostal space, we will have collateral structures. Small nerve, small artery, and a small vein. So these three structures are the collaterals. Collateral intercostal nerve, artery, and vein. So you notice that the middle of the intercostal space is free of artery, vein, and nerve. So if one has to introduce a needle through the intercostal space, which is sometimes done to aspirate fluid or to relieve a pneumothorax, you would put the needle right smack dab in the middle of the intercostal space, middle going from superior to inferior. So you would come right through here and not put any of these structures at risk. Now, there are some other structures we need to look at on the thoracic wall, and the first is going to be a layer of fascia. And this layer of fascia runs along the entire internal surface of the thoracic wall. And this fascia is called the endothoracic fascia. The endothoracic fascia is deep fascia, but it's also, unlike most deep fasciae, is a very loose fascia, which means it's easy to separate structures in this plane. And the structure, it's just internal to the endothoracic fascia, is the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura. I've shown that in a light green. Now, the pleura is a sac that surrounds and invests each lung. And it has one layer that is applied to the surface of the lung. That's known as the visceral pleura. And then the parietal pleura is applied to the body wall, to the diaphragm, or to the mediastinum, depending on where you're looking. And we see this right next to the endothoracic fascia. Now, if one was doing surgery and needed to separate the pleura from the body wall, the endothoracic fascia, being a nice loose fascia, would be easy to separate. And indeed, that can be done. And since it's easy to separate, that puts the parietal pleura itself at very little risk. So you can separate the parietal pleura from the body wall without risking tearing the parietal pleura. This will conclude our discussion of the thoracic wall, and in the next series of videos we will talk about the lungs and the associated structures of the bronchial tree. Thank you for your attention.